Okay. So, academic slide design, like I told you earlier, is kind of a continuation of the cognitive load presentation that I did a couple weeks ago. So we'll start by doing just kind of a brief overview of cognitive load theory. I would suggest going back and watching the other one if you haven't, to get kind of a better idea, especially if you feel like that's something that kind of piques your interest. Then definitely go back and check that out. Then we'll spend about 10 minutes talking about how to organize an actual slide-based presentation. 15 minutes talking about some different things that you should be doing in the preparation stages for your slide-based presentations. And then about an hour on talking about actual design elements of slides. And these are all just kind of estimates, so it might be that we spend a little more time on the front end and a little less time on the back end. I don't know. This is my first time through this presentation, so I'm guessing somewhere about an hour and a half. We'll just kind of wait and see. So anyways, let's start with our overview of cognitive load theory. So this is kind of the know your enemy version or phase of the presentation. The academic slide design principles are all kind of designed to mitigate cognitive load. So if you don't really know what cognitive load is, then it's harder to really appreciate the why of what we're doing with the design principles. So cognitive load theory is really kind of the logistics of cognitive architecture, and leads to knowledge acquisition and kind of lends itself to how we construct meaning-making structures. So it's all about how we receive information, process information, organize it, store it, and all of that. And there's three different types of cognitive load. You've got intrinsic and extraneous and germane. So we'll look at each of those briefly here. Intrinsic load is just inherently or intrinsically how difficult something is. So physics is going to be intrinsically more difficult than algebra. Microbiology is intrinsically going to be more difficult than physical science. So it's just kind of the inherent complexity of what the subject matter is that you're teaching. Extraneous load are the things that we include in our instruction that do not directly add to knowledge acquisition or meaning-making structures. So it's kind of the decorative stuff that we put in there sometimes that don't really do anything to communicate any meaningful content. And then germane load is all of the things that we do in our instruction that lead to learning, right? The cognitive mechanisms that end up forming schema and all of those things. So we want to reduce intrinsic and extraneous load and increase germane load. That's kind of our overall goal with everything that we're doing, is to decrease the intrinsic and extraneous and increase germane. And the three of those together are what create cognitive load. The other major component of cognitive load theory has to do with how we process incoming information. So generally we process information mostly in two ways. We hear things and we see things. So we refer to these as the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketch pad. And those two things together form what we refer to as working memory. So working memory is kind of the engine of learning, really. That's the cognitive mechanism we use most to receive information and start to build our schemas. And it is very limited in capacity and duration. So what that means is I can only hold a certain amount of information, and I can only hold it for a certain period of time. Especially for community college students or really any kind of novice learner, that limitation is going to be kind of accentuated. If I know nothing about a subject coming in, then my working memory capacity is going to be less than somebody who maybe has had 1 or 2 classes, right? So if you're teaching the second part of the course, the working memory capacity is going to be a little bit greater. If you're teaching a junior student, that working memory is going to be greater than a freshman student, and so on and so forth. But still, we all have limitations on our working memory. There's only so much that we can take in and hold it there for a certain amount of time. So again, going back to kind of our overall goal, the big picture is that we want the total cognitive load, which is those 3 different types added together. We want that to be less than our working memory capacity. Okay, so everything that we're kind of doing with the design principles is geared towards this, is geared towards limiting the total cognitive load so that it is less than our students' working memory capacity. All the while keeping in mind that we're talking about novice learners with community college students. Their content knowledge is limited, their study skills are limited, their metacognitive skills are limited, so in all ways their working memory capacity is a little low. Just kind of a brief overview of the learning process. You have your information coming in, goes into working memory. That's where your schema construction begins. And then once we do some tasks to retrieve this information, it gets encoded into our long-term memory, which has unlimited storage capacity. So we never actually lose any kind of information that we store there. We only lose the ability to retrieve that information. Okay, so just because I can't recall it on the spot doesn't mean it's not there. I need a proper stimulus to be able to retrieve that information. And in long-term memory, our schemas, which start to be built over here, begin to become more complex until we get to the point where we have the ability to transfer these schemas or our knowledge into some other context. So that's, our main goal is that we want to be able to teach our students the theory and all of that, and then have them apply it to practice in real-world scenarios. So that's that transfer of knowledge that we're really kind of after. All right, so that is our overview on cognitive load theory. Again, if that seems interesting to you, there is a whole session on that is included in the virtual professional development, so check that out. So this portion will be talking about the organization of a slide deck. And when I say slide deck, I'm just talking about the collection of slides that constitute a slide-based presentation. So first and foremost, if you are here or you are watching this, it likely means that you kind of want some different results than what you're currently getting with your design for your slides. So if you want those different results, you're going to have to take a different approach to the way that you create your slides. So a lot of the things that we're going to look at seem like they might be time consuming, and that's because they are. The more you do it, the better you'll get at it, and it's kind of one of those deals where, what's it worth to you? Is this something that you really kind of want to change, or are you not really willing to put forth the time and effort? Because, doing some of these things is going to take you some time. Myself, I put several hours into designing, one of these slide-based presentations and being ready to kind of talk about it. So it's not something that's kind of a quick and easy fix. You can kind of take some of these things, without doing all of it, kind of take some pieces and apply them here and there. But just know that if you want different results, you're going to have to try a different approach. So traditionally, our slides kind of look like this, right? You've got a title, and then you've got some bullets, and most of the time you're going to have some sort of hierarchy or outline type structure. So this comes directly from that title plus content default slide that PowerPoint offers you. and we'll refer to this as the topic subtopic design. So later on, if you hear me refer to something as being topic subtopic design, this is what I'm talking about. And so the biggest problem with the traditional use of slides is that we're attempting to use this for three things at once, right? We don't want to do that. We want to use it for only one thing. Okay, so the topic subtopic design uses slides as visual aids, handouts, and speaker notes all at the same time. So we need all of those things, right? If we're doing a presentation, all of those things are probably going to be helpful to us, but we don't have to accomplish all three of those things with our slides. So what we're going to talk about today is using our slides as visual aids. So we can have speaker notes, we can have handouts, and those are good things to have, but we don't want to use our slides as all three of these things at once. Okay, we all like acronyms, and so an easy way to kind of remember our goal with our design is that we want our end result to be clear, consistent, and cohesive. We'll talk more about the consistency in this presentation really than any of the other two, but clear, consistent, and cohesive is what we want our overall presentation to be. And just kind of as a side note, this entire, for the most part, other than the first portion of the presentation where we're talking about cognitive load, this entire presentation is coming from a book called Academic Slide Design by a woman named Anne Fandry. So you'll see me referencing her on several of these slides. The book is available for free online in PDF format. So I encourage you to go and find that. I think I ended up having to download it in sections or chapters, but it's available out there for free, and it's really, really good. So if you want to kind of expand your knowledge base on this, then definitely go check that out. So the first thing is we might not always need a slide, and that's something you mentioned earlier is that you don't always need it. So in the book, Fandry says we need a slide if and only if it provides a visual means of organization, if it helps students locate where they are in the lecture, and I'm going to refer to this as wayfinding. And so what that is if you don't provide some of these design elements and some of these structures that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, it goes back to the cognitive load thing. I want students focused on the content, right? I don't want them thinking, how much time do I have left? And what does this really even have to do with what he talked about a few minutes ago? And, how much of the presentation is left? And so instead of them thinking of those things, we're going to provide them with some mechanisms throughout the presentation that help them know where they're at and know kind of how the information is going to be displayed to make it a little more intuitive for them, and again, lowering the overall cognitive load. If you show a concept, process, relationship, or idea via graph, chart, etc., then you need a slide for that. If it maps directly to the learning objectives, or if it contributes to good digital citizenry. So that would really be kind of like your reference slide or any kind of slide that you use to give credit to anybody that you're using their sources. Okay, so if it doesn't do one of these things, then maybe you don't need a slide. Maybe you need a handout or something else. But if it doesn't accomplish one of these goals, at least consider the possibility that maybe you don't actually need a slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about three different types of what I call organizational or guidepost slides. Okay, so one of those is called a preview slide, and that's the picture I'm showing you here is from the preview slide that I showed you from this presentation. So that gives the students a good idea of what the presentation is going to look like and how it's going to progress. So I don't have to wonder, is this going to be 10 minutes? Is this going to be 40 minutes? Is this going to be an hour and a half? So let them know ahead of time what you're doing, how long it's going to take, and any other kind of vital information that they might need. You know, a quick and easy way to do this is just with your learning objectives. And then out beside your learning objectives, in parentheses, you can put 5 minutes or 15 minutes or however much time you're going to spend on each one. And then it also, you know, will activate any prior knowledge that they have about any kind of concepts or topics that you might be covering. So the next type of organizational slide is what we call a guidepost slide. And those are the ones that tip you off that, hey, we're switching gears here. We're switching from one topic to another topic. And again, it's providing context for the student so that they can activate whatever knowledge that they already have, and the incoming knowledge now has a better chance of being connected to something, right? And again, this is all about reducing the overall cognitive load. We haven't even started talking about actually designing or design elements of the slides. This is all just organization and doing everything that we can possibly do to reduce the overall cognitive load so that our working memory capacity is focused on content and not trying to figure out what's going on. And then you always want to have at least one summary slide. If you have your presentation kind of chopped into pieces, then it might be a good idea to have a summary of each segment. But at the very least, you want to have a summary slide at the very end that goes back and highlights those main ideas that you've been trying to get across. So if somehow you've said something 5 times throughout the presentation and they still didn't hear it, then you've got that one last summary slide where you can kind of get everybody's attention right there at the end and say, hey guys, if you don't take anything else out of today, I need you to take these things out of today. Make sure you write these 3 or 5 things down or however many. So that's a preview slide, guidepost slide, and recap slide. Those are all just organizational aspects that you can use to reduce your students' overall cognitive load. We said earlier we want clear, consistent, and cohesive presentations. Consistency, again, makes wayfinding easier for students and reduces the overall cognitive load. Some of the things that we can do to, or some of the things that we kind of need to keep in mind when it comes to trying to be consistent is using consistent fonts, using the same kind of layout with your section headers. Section headers are the same as those guidepost slides from before. That's just another way to say guidepost slides. So if you're going to use them, they need to be the same every time so that when that slide comes through, the student knows, okay, well, this means I'm switching topics. If you use a different layout every time or a different design every time, then it kind of loses its function, right? It doesn't serve the same function anymore. If you're going to have repeated elements, put them in the same place, like the page numbers, for instance. Don't have those moving all over the place. If there's something that's going to pop up multiple times, then keep that kind of in the same place. Your color scheme, and then your surface level design features, which we'll talk more in depth about those here in a few minutes. Actually, color scheme is something we'll talk about now. This is really more of a design element, so it could have just as easily been put towards the end of the presentation. But it is one of the main components in maintaining consistency, so I decided to put it here in the presentation. All right, so you really only should have 4 colors in your whole slide deck. Okay, so you want 1 color for background and 1 color for text. Most of the time, I'm gonna stick with black and white for those 2 things. Either black background or a white background. and then white text or black text. Just because it gives you a good contrast, the text is always going to stand out from the background, and you're never going to have to worry about, anything not being visible. So you've got your background color, your text color, and then two colors of emphasis. Anything more than that gets a little busy with the eyes, and it's harder to keep consistent throughout with that many colors. I put the color wheel here because the best way to pick your colors is to use either complementary colors. Complementary colors are those ones that are across from one another. Use analogous colors, which are right beside one another on the color wheel. Or you can use what's called, triadic colors, which are the same distance apart. So if this is my first one, I'll go 2 in each direction. So these 3 right here would be an example of triadic colors. Okay? And color theory says that those should go together fairly well. Complementary colors, analogous colors, and triadic colors. Color should be used as a means of communication, not for decoration, right? So we want to use color only to communicate things, not to decorate things. That would be an example of extraneous load. So when you look at this slide, Todd, what do you think the purpose of the colors is here?
Well, it represents each of the different.
Right. Do you feel like there's a reason for looking at the steps? Do you feel like there's a reason that they should be different colors?
I like it as Royce did.
Yeah, it is. It's the rainbow, right? So here's there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. The downside of it would be students could look at this and be like, okay, well, why is this the color of a rainbow? Like, is that supposed to communicate something? Is this like some sort of LGBT thing? Like what, why is this red and why is that yellow? If you're using this same color scheme throughout, and red means something and yellow means something and blue means something, cool, then I already know. But if I'm just using random colors all the way throughout, then it leaves it up in the air for the student to decide, why is that one red and that one yellow and that one blue and that one purple? Is there some reason that, Selena, if you don't mind sitting on that side, just because of my camera. That's kind of the downside of it. It creates questions that are not necessarily, or that shouldn't necessarily be asked. Whereas if you're using consistency and you've only got 2 colors, then every time I see one of those 2 colors, I kind of know what the purpose of that is.
So would you alternate if you had, whatever this is, 6?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I wouldn't have 6. I'd stick to 4, 1 color for the background, 1 color for the text, and then...
I was actually referring to
okay.
Slide. So would you have, prepare be a light blue, and then present be a light green, and then back 3?
Yeah. What I would probably do would be either have them all the same color unless there was some reason that they needed to be different colors, or probably take different shades of one of my emphasis colors. So have one really dark and then kind of work my way up lighter as I go up. But again, then that you might have some students asking, well, why is this lighter? Does that mean it's less important than the one that's darker? So that's why I would probably just keep them all the same. And then if I needed to emphasize something, then I could do something like this and say, hey, you really need to pay attention to this one right here. So just be careful about your use of color and be conscious of the fact that we're going to process color as a means of communication. So you need to be intentional about how you're using color on your slides. We can use color to call attention to things. So like in this left-hand slide here, that's in, I think, Latin. So it's not, I don't even speak that language, but I can tell you what the most important word is and that it probably relates to whatever that orange arrow is pointing to, right? So it's calling attention to those two things. And then there on the right side, anytime we can use color and some sort of quantitative representation of data together, that's always a good thing because charts are very visual, and if you can use color in conjunction with that, that tends to be a very good visual aid to use. Again, here we see color being used in conjunction with a chart, which is always nice. And then on top of that, we're using it to show, in this case, severity. So just like what I said a second ago, I would start with a dark and then work my way to a lighter. And then you might have students wonder, well, why is this one darker and that one lighter? Is this one more important? So here, the one that's darker is the most important, whereas the one that is the lightest shade is the least important. So that's an example of exactly that. We can use color to differentiate different sections of a graph, and again here we see color being used with a chart. So just looking at this without reading the X or the Y axis, I kind of am able to digest a good bit of information and kind of understand what's going on to a certain degree just because of the color, right? I can tell you some things about the leftmost and the rightmost columns just by looking at it color-wise. I don't have to know what the X and Y axis are to make some inferences, right? This one has more of the purple than that one does. I don't know what the purple is, but that one over there has got more of it, right? And then we can use color to provide a visual break. So in this example, one of these things is not like the others. So it immediately, my eye is drawn to the purple slide, which tells me, hey, there's three things going on here, and then the yellow are those three things. So just some different ways to use color and some alternatives to your more traditional slide-based designs. Then we also mentioned being consistent with surface level design features. So here, if you'll pay attention to the heart and the wine glass, the ones that are on top of each other, directly top and bottom, you'll notice as you go from left to right, they all kind of go together. The top goes with the bottom. So I wouldn't want to, say, use the top left heart with the wine glass that's second from the right. Just because those surface level design features are very, very different. The heart is kind of more cartoonish, and then that wine glass looks very, very realistic. So if you're going to use the cartoonish stuff, then use it throughout. If you're going to use more realistic looking stuff, then use it throughout. If not, so inconsistency leads to unnecessary questions being asked, right? Or it can lead to unnecessary questions being asked. You see something that's inconsistent, your mind goes to why is this inconsistent? Whereas if I am consistent, then I can break that consistency and immediately communicate something, right? If I've been consistent with things all the way throughout, and then I can break it, and they're going to notice it, and they're going to be drawn to it immediately. So consistency enables me to use novelty to my advantage, right? I can break that consistency and kind of use that to draw attention. All right, so up to this point, we have talked about the fact that we should use slides for one purpose instead of three purposes. So instead of using a slide as a visual aid, a handout, and speaker notes, we should just be using our slides as visual aids. Okay, we can have speaker notes and we can have handouts, but those need to be separate from our slides. You don't always need to have a slide, right? So there was a list of 5 things that we went through. So if if your slide doesn't meet one of those 5 criteria, then you need to probably at least ask yourself the question, do I really need a slide here? Do I really need something to back up what I'm saying visually? Consistency is going to reduce overall cognitive load, leaving more working memory capacity to be focused on content. We should be using color to communicate our content, not to decorate our slides. And we should try to only have 4 colors used in our whole presentation. 1 for background, 1 for text, and 2 for emphasis. And our overall goal is to have a clear, consistent, and cohesive presentation. All right, so we've done an overview of cognitive load. We've talked about some organizational tips with a little bit of design stuff with the color there. So now we're going to talk about kind of how to prepare for your slide-based presentation, and then we'll end by looking at some very specific design strategies for creating content-based slides and not the organizational slides that we've looked at. So first and foremost, with your slide-based presentations, you always want to start with pen and paper. And that's really kind of true with anything that you do. You're more creative with pen and paper. Just naturally, people are more creative with pen and paper than they are when they sit down to a computer. If you sit down to prepare for a slide-based presentation, and the first thing you do is open PowerPoint, you are automatically boxed into the things that PowerPoint has to offer you, right? So there's 6, 7, 8 different default templates or default slide templates in PowerPoint. You are much more likely to kind of gear your design for slides into one of those 6 or 7 default templates if that's what you have at your disposal while you're in your preparation and design phases. Whereas if you sit down with the pen and paper beforehand and kind of start there and get everything on pen and paper and then take it into PowerPoint. So by the time you sit down and open up PowerPoint, your presentation should be pretty much already done. Okay, so let's look at some ways that, or some things that we can do. So I write a script. I don't usually end up using it for the most part for these type presentations. My script turns into more of an outline with lots of headings and subheadings, and then maybe some little anecdotal evidence type stuff over in the margins or something. Actually, I'll just show y'all what my script looks like. The other thing is with using Word, if you get used to using headings and subheadings, then this little table of contents thing, which is super easy to create if you're using heading and subheadings, that helps out a lot when you're coming back to it later and you're trying to, kind of organize your thoughts, and you can just go to your table of contents and be like, oh, okay, cool. So this is what I kind of have thus far, and it's super helpful. So what I usually do is just sit down and start typing as if I'm talking to someone in class. And how would I explain this to someone just kind of in narrative form? And as I'm doing that, I'm forcing myself to organize my thoughts, right? So that's why I like to use the headings and the subheadings, because this is forcing me to organize my thoughts, which later on is going to, those headings and subheadings are going to end up being titles for my PowerPoint slides, or they're going to end up being bullet points for my PowerPoint slides, or they're going to end up being things that I focus on. Okay, I need a visual to communicate this idea right here. So, I mean, you can see it's not necessarily a script, but, I could, if I wanted to, go back, like say for a distance course, if I wanted to have a more kind of higher production value lecture video that didn't come from class or something, I could more easily record a voiceover PowerPoint with something like this, right? That's going to keep me more concise. It's going to keep me from kind of chasing rabbit holes and keep my video a little bit shorter than it would be if I sat down and just started talking, you know? So that was step one, write a script, then prepare a handout, identify and sketch visuals, create slides, insert your organizational slides that we talked about, the preview, guidepost, and recap slides, and then use it and see how it works and revise it from there. And so we'll kind of walk through each of those and kind of look at some different things we can do with each of those steps. So I just showed you what I do for my scripts. For the handouts, I usually create my handout while I'm creating my presentation. So you can see the handout that you have there, why I would need to create that while I'm creating the presentation, because it follows the presentation, right? So if you're going to do something like that, then I would say you would probably want to do it while you're doing your presentation so that it follows along nicely. If you're going to do like a graphic organizer or a concept map or some sort of outline or something, I would recommend doing that before you do your presentation, because that's, again, forcing you to organize your thoughts, which is going to be helpful when you get to the point of actually creating your presentation. The more you can have your thoughts organized about what's important, what's less important, before you get to the point of creating your presentation, the better. So I would recommend doing those beforehand. Okay, so a handout should do these three things for you. And so before, when I said you don't always need a slide, that doesn't mean you don't necessarily want to still communicate all that same information, but you have some other means to be able to do that. So for some things, I mean, there's just going to be a lot of text. I mean, if it's technically dense or if it's just got a lot of steps that are involved in a process, I mean, it is what it is. There's intrinsically complex things that we have to teach. We can't change the nature of that. So I still need to communicate that information to my students, but it doesn't necessarily have to be on a slide. I can print it on a handout and hand it to them that way, and then they can go and look at it later. Okay, the slides should be used as a visual aid to support the main ideas that I'm trying to communicate during my lecture. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say that I am guilty of using these as handouts. This is just something that the lady that wrote this book pointed specifically to, because so many of us do use these as handouts. So try to avoid using these as handouts, just because it kind of limits what students are able to do in terms of taking their notes. If we organize their notes for them in some other form, graphic organizer, concept map, those type things, they're just much more valuable study materials for the students to have. So my favorite type of handout is what you have now, which is what I refer to as guided notes or skeleton guided notes. Some people use one word or the other. Some people use both words to describe it. But I put this particular example on here just to kind of show you that guided notes can be used in any content area. This was like my go-to thing when I was still teaching math. So this is actually an example of some notes that I had when I still taught Algebra 2. So instead of having them define what a radical expression is up there at the top, and then at the top of the second page there, instead of having them define this relationship in these symbolic terms, which they don't understand, and a lot of them are scared to even write these symbolic representations down. So instead of having them write that stuff down, I have that ready for them already. Because what I really want them to do in math class is what? I want them to do math, right? I don't really want them to spend their time defining things. I want them doing math. So you can see they still have plenty of stuff to actually write on the page, right? They're still writing plenty. I've just created a skeleton for them. Now they've got nice, neat, organized notes. And it's funny though, some of them still can take something like this and make it unorganized. It's amazing. But it's always kind of been my go-to. I've always really liked guided notes. I feel like they keep people engaged a little bit better than they otherwise would be. It helps to summarize your main points for you. And then, like I mentioned earlier, it provides your students with a good, organized, and structured set of notes that they can refer back to when they go to study. All right, so next in our list of things to do to kind of prepare is to identify and sketch your visuals. So when I say sketch, I actually mean sketch, because at this point we're still analog, we're still pen and paper. Okay? So first let's kind of talk about how to choose good visual aids and how to kind of select what would be an appropriate visual aid, and then I'll give you some drawing tips. All right, so read these bullet points for me real quick and tell me what's the main idea of this slide. Just overall general main idea. The only thing that really clues me into the main idea of this is memory recall, and then the second bullet point that says number of items on the list matters. So it's talking about our ability to kind of store information and recall it for a prolonged period of time. So it's talking about memory, right? And so Todd, you mentioned an elephant never forgets. What if I have never heard that, was not aware of that saying? Does this elephant have any meaning in or effectiveness in supporting the main idea of the slide, which is talking about something to do with memory and how long we can remember things?
When I see the elephant, all I think is roll tide.
Right.
I'm sorry.
I'm thinking if they don't know that, they obviously are culturally deprived and never saw the Jungle Book.
Right. Well, or they're not from our culture. Right? So we don't have a lot of international students here, so that's not really an issue. But the point being, if you're not aware of the elephant never forgets thing, then the elephant, you're like, what's going on here? Like this is not helpful at all. All right, so what about this? Same slide, right? What did you say?
Discrimination.
Yeah.
But I said that, culturally, teaching online, you have students.
From anywhere, yeah. So, if it's somebody from a culture where elephants are like some sacred animal, then it might be offensive to them. So, all right, so what is this image? It's the same slide.
Memory chip.
Yeah.
Is it?
Well, electronic.
How do you know it's a memory chip? Or are you just assuming it's a memory chip?
Last time I replaced a memory chip in a computer, which goes back like 15 years ago now,
Uh-huh.
I vaguely remember them looking similar to that.
So that is actually a memory chip? I just assumed it was some kind of random picture of some sort of
You don't know what
hard.
it is either.
Nah, I mean, I assumed that it was supposed to be, that I was supposed to assume that it was a memory chip. But again, if I don't know what that is or what the intricacies of a computer look like, then this doesn't do anything to support my main idea. What about that? Does that support the main idea? What about that? Does that have...
For me, when I look at that, I think, cool, anatomy.
Right.
And then I lose everything on the left side.
Well, I mean, so the main idea is something about memory and how long we can remember things, right? So a picture of a brain, not necessarily supporting that. I mean, we use our brain to remember things, but we use our brain for a lot of other stuff too, right? So the point being, when we go to identify a visual aid, the main question needs to be, does it support the main idea that I'm trying to get across, right? It's much easier for me to meet that goal if my slide only has one main idea, which is one of the big takeaways that I want you to get out of today, that each slide should only convey one main idea. If I'm only conveying one main idea, it's much, much easier for me to select graphics and visuals that support that one main idea. Okay, so if the graphic doesn't support the main idea, it's not a visual aid, it is a decoration. That means it's extraneous load. That means it's taking away from my working memory capacity that I could be putting forth towards content. So what about this graphic?
Now I know what primacy and recency effects are.
So human tendency to remember the first and last items, and then you have a graph that is specifically related to that one main idea. So going back to that slide versus that slide. Okay, this is actually something that we'll talk about here in a few minutes. This is a strategy called assertion evidence, where you make an assertion and then you have some sort of visual evidence to back it up. So, all right, so read through those bullet points and tell me what the main idea is here. And notice the title of the slide.
The main idea is just newborn imprinting.
Right? So, first of all, have I conveyed one main idea with the slide? Or have I conveyed more than one main idea with the slide?
I'm thinking at least two. We talk about imprinting and you also talk
Right.
about Lorenz.
And then 1935, okay, 1935, what? Was he born in 1935? Did he come up with this in 1935? There's just a lot of information that maybe is important, but in this case, I'm conveying more than one main idea. Okay, so with the title saying, is it filial? Filial imprinting, I would say that last bullet point is really the only bullet point that I really need in terms of text here. So let's say that is my main idea, this filial imprinting. Would that be an appropriate visual aid to support that main idea? Do you think this is an effective graphic to support filial imprinting? This is just a picture of some dude, right? I'm assuming it's probably Mr. Lorenz. I'm assuming that's who it is. But it's not supporting my main idea. It's not a visual aid, it's a decoration. Okay, so now let's take a look at the makeover slide.
Yeah, because you got the little ducks behind him.
Okay, so what's different about this slide than the previous slide?
There's action to
Yeah,
it. It's
there's
showing
action.
something happening.
Right?
that he's following.
Is there more text or less text? Right?
Is he blowing on something? Is it a duck call?
I think he's got a pipe. Yeah.
If they're blowing into something like calling them geese or something.
So again, this is that assertion evidence strategy where you make an assertion and then you have some sort of visual aid to back that up, when we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But one main idea, filial imprinting, and then this visual that shows me, what that looks like. So I can guarantee you, come test time, I'm going to remember some ducks following some old guy around. Whether or not that helps me answer the question about filial imprinting, that's going to stick out to me, right? So this would be an appropriate or an effective visual aid. So another thing that I'll say today that might step on your toes, which I'll also say that it steps on my own toes because I've done it as well. is to just generally kind of stay away from the built-in themes in PowerPoint. They tend to kind of break a lot of the design rules that we talk about in terms of consistency with font, consistency with color. They always tend to have some distracting elements to them as well. So try to, as much as possible, just kind of stay away from any kind of built-in themes. Okay, really less is more. The simpler, the better. So what I do when I say start with a pen and paper, this is the template that I use when I start to plan and create a presentation. I said earlier you should be almost done with your entire presentation by the time you sit down to open up PowerPoint. So this is how I make my presentations, and then I will transfer them into PowerPoint, right? So you sketch out kind of the whole thing, and then once you're done with that, you can go sit down, and then it's more of a, not necessarily copy and paste, but just, you know, moving information from one place to another. So here is your drawing tips. Well, before that, just want to point out that I do have specifically a spot on here for me to identify what the main idea is for each slide, just so it forces me to always be cognizant of, hey, you need to have one and only one main idea for each one of these slides. So right above the slide, I have a spot for me to put what is my main idea here, and then that, you know, later I can go back and say, hey, is all this stuff, you know, going towards that one main idea, or do I have too much stuff here? Do I need more slides? All right, so the drawing tip is just draw stuff that you can remember what it is later. You're the only person that's going to be looking at this, right? So if you know what the weird little blob thing is over in the corner, that's all that really matters. Or just describe the visual that you want to use instead of actually drawing it out. So if you want to use some sort of logo, then just put, you know, Exxon logo here, whatever. You don't actually have to draw it, just describe it. That was one thing that I kind of struggled with for a long time when I would have people give me these type of suggestions. I'm like, well, I can't draw. You want me to sketch out the visuals I'm going to use? I can't, like you said, I can't draw a straight line. So just do the best you can, and, you know, make it to where when you come back later, you know what you were thinking about. So you're the only person that has to be able to decipher your hieroglyphics. So, and then you leave some space to elaborate. So, you know, what do you want to make sure that you say? What do you want to, you know, make sure that you don't forget, that you don't leave out? Maybe you leave yourself some notes about how things are going to be organized on the slide itself. But you can, you know, kind of sketch out your entire presentation in this template and be ready to go when you go into PowerPoint. And now I'm not letting the PowerPoint defaults dictate how I do things. I've already decided how things are going to be. I'm just using PowerPoint as a tool to recreate what I've already created over here on pen and paper. All right, so to recap our second section there on preparation. Start with analog tools and then move to digital tools. You'd use guided notes and handouts to elaborate instead of using your slides to do all of those things. Visual aids are to be communicative and not decorative. You want to avoid using built-in themes, and it helps to use a template to organize your presentation before you get started with your digital stuff. All right, so from this point to the end, we'll be talking about more how to actually design slides that have content on them. So we talked about the organizational slides at the first of the presentation, preview slides, guidepost slides, and recap slides. Those are separate from these type of slides, right? These are the ones that actually have the content on them that we want to teach with. So before we get into actual strategies, we're going to look at some of the common flaws in design, some of the common mishaps. I always like to refer to it as knowing your enemy, right? If I know what I'm trying to not do, it makes it easier to not do it, right? So first we'll look at some of the more common mistakes people make. So without proper preparation, what do you think some of the most common mistakes are that you see? There's one that's super common. Think of any PowerPoint presentation that you've ever sat through, right? So, and bullets kind of get a bad rap. They're not just inherently bad. They're just like anything else. They have a purpose. They have a reason to be used. But we use bullets just for everything, right? So it's that topic, subtopic design slide that we looked at before, where you've got a title, then you've got bullets, and most of the time, bullets in some sort of outline form. So you get kind of really just a segmented outline of your chapter, where you just kind of take your chapter and cut it into pieces and then put those pieces on slides, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but we can do a better job of communicating the main ideas of that information with some visual aids, right? And instead of having 3, 4, 5, 6 main ideas on a slide, having one main idea on a slide. I try to stay away from bullets as much as possible, but they do have a time and a place, you know. The other thing is that without the preparation steps, it can kind of just turn into like a hodgepodge of semi-related concepts, right? You've got a lot of slides that are kind of related to the same main idea, but they don't really have any cohesiveness to them, right? There's just kind of, you're over here, then you're over here, then you're talking about this, and then you're talking about that, and the people in the room are like, what's going on? I thought we were talking about this, and now we're talking about that, and now, you know, like, perfect example would be, right? I love, like, he's a great presenter. He is. But his slides don't, like, they have nothing to do with what he's talking about 95% of the time, right? Like, he'll have something on the board, and then he talks for 30 minutes before he ever moves the slide forward, and then he'll go through, like, 20 slides and be like, oh, we already talked about that. We don't need to talk about that. And they're all, you know, the traditional bullets and all that. Now, that's not taken away from him as a presenter, because I still feel like the things that he says are relevant and meaningful. He's humorous and does a good job just generally presenting material. But in terms of his slides, he makes a lot of these very common mistakes where you've got just kind of, the stuff is all related, but it doesn't really, you know, gel very well together.
Sounds like you just need to quit using slides.
And that's something that, you know, Todd mentioned before, that, you know, before we got started, he was like, you know, for some of my lectures, I just stop using slides. And there's a time and a place for that too. So what about this slide? What's wrong with this one?
Too small.
Too small. Too much. Right? The background makes it hard to read. The small font size makes it hard to read. I'm going to assume there's more than one main idea here. I'm not going to read that. I'm not even going to attempt to read that, but I'm just going to go ahead and assume that there's more than one main idea. And you know, I mean, looks like a URL or something, and then a copyright. Oh, the little globe thing. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. So again, that's a perfect example of extraneous load, right? That has nothing to do with the information on this slide. And so instead of her concentrating on the information on the slide, she's worried about this picture down here. And that happens. It does. I mean, especially for if you're you know, talking about kids that have ADHD or ADD, you know, they're going to stick and focus on those type things. Kids that are on the Asperger's spectrum, autism spectrum, it's much harder for them to just kind of let that kind of stuff go, right? Once they see it, they're stuck on it, and they're like, it's virtually impossible for them to get away from it and start focusing on the information itself. So if it's not supporting your main idea, it's decorative, it's extraneous, we need to get rid of it. So really here, though, the biggest thing is just too much, right? And that is the overall main mistake that people make, is that they try to put too much on one slide. One main idea per slide is all that we need. Here's, again, going back to the topic, subtopic, bullet point thing. What usually ends up happening is what you see here, where you've got your main idea. The first bullet point is usually supporting that. Then you kind of have some semi-related stuff for a few things, and then you're like, oh, well, I need to round out I need to make it a full slide, so let me just add this other thing in here too. So you usually end up with one, maybe two slides that really are bullet points that really need to be there, and the rest of it is stuff that you're not going to ask them about anyway. It's not going to be assessed, or it could be put on a handout or in some guided notes of some sort. All right, what about this one? What's the focal point of this?
It's hard to tell.
There's like 7, right? There's no focal point. Nothing sticks out because everything sticks out. There's a lot of movement. There's a lot of color. There's really nowhere for me to get into the slide, right? Like, do I start at the top left? Do I start with the graphic there on the right? Like, I don't know where to start. Naturally, our eyes kind of do a Z pattern when we read PowerPoint slides. So, because if you'll think about it, that's kind of, the title, and then we kind of go down the bullet points and then back across. So if you'll notice, when it's just a natural inclination of ours to our eye kind of follows a Z pattern. So even knowing that, I kind of try to do the Z pattern thing, and it still doesn't help. I still don't know what's going on. Naturally, we like to kind of look at things left to right, top to bottom, that type stuff. But even knowing all of that and trying to force myself into looking at it in all those different ways, I still can't really get into the slide at a good point and make anything of it. So again, yes, it is very hot in here. One slide, one main idea. Each slide should seek to convey one and only one main idea. Okay, so we did mention that bullets were something that just kind of we all agree are overused and that don't really necessarily need to be used. So let's talk about specifically the problem with using bullets. So there's a few problems. So first of all, it creates speaker notes for us and ends up being sort of a teleprompter or a slide view prompter, as this Anne Fandry lady who wrote this book calls it. So instead of me having to kind of remember what I'm going to say or having some speaker notes, I just read the slides, right? That's what turns into the death by PowerPoint people reading their slides, is instead of them using the slides as visual aids, they're using it to prompt themselves of what they want to say. The other problem with bullets is that it creates what's called the split attention effect, where you have people reading the board, you have people hearing what you're saying and trying to write all at the same time, right? So my attention, my working memory is split into 3 different things, whereas if I'm only using my slides as visual aids, then I don't have that problem. So overuse of bullet leads to this split attention effect, and it's humanly impossible to do all 3 of those things well simultaneously, right? You can't listen and write and look and do all 3 of those things to a high level. one of those three or two of those three things is going to suffer. And then you can't, it's impossible to convey complex relationships with bullets. There's just no way to do it. So if you're teaching something that has complex relationships, which for the most part we all are, at least at some point, there's going to be some complex relationships that exist. There's really no way for you to express those relationships with bullets. You're going to have to do something else. So if bullets have a purpose, then what is that purpose? Because they're there for a reason, you know. So we can use bullets to do a few things. Explain an idea with several supporting statements. I would usually say anything more than 3 or 4 bullet points on a slide is going to be too much, though. Show an overview of some stuff you've already explained, right? So kind of as a summary slide, list some bullet points there. And then, again, to provide a summary. So to show an overview of stuff you've already done, to provide a summary of some things you've already talked about, but again, going back to that whole bullets can't convey complex relationships, you know, for the most part, that's what we're trying to do as educators, is to convey complex relationships. So let's look at some design strategies that we can use to convey those complex relationships. So these design strategies are specific to content slides, not to the organizational slides that we talked about a little while ago. Okay, so we have 8 things that we're going to talk about here, and I think all of these are already in your guided notes, so you don't have to worry about trying to jot all of those down. But again, let me reiterate that all of these strategies are under the overarching framework of one main idea per slide. Okay, so with each one of these that we'll look at, keep in mind that that's kind of our overarching goal, is to convey one main idea per slide. Okay, so we're going to look at some befores and afters here. So again, what's wrong with this slide? A lot of stuff going on, right? You've got the topic, subtopic design with the outline. Yeah, the background does not do the foreground any favors. There's too much text. It's too small. You've got spacing issues. There's just lots of stuff going on, right? I'm going to say there's probably more than one main idea here. Okay, so here is the slide makeover for this slide. Okay, so now the main idea is very evident, right? There's 4 sections, which I can tell you there's 4 something without even reading the text, right? Because I see those 4 things. My eyes immediately drawn to that longest bar right there. So that's what I'm looking at first, and I see that says 50,000 words. So then I'm like, oh, okay, well the other ones have to be, you know, some lesser amount of words. So you're, without reading anything, or with reading very little, you're gaining information very quickly, right? And beginning to form relationships about what's going on here. All right, so I was going to pause here and kind of let y'all read through this, but since we're running kind of long already, these 3 slides, the main idea is basically to define theme and motif. And then that last slide down there at the bottom, the main idea of that is to kind of describe the interplay between plot, characters, and director. Okay, so this is the original, and again, your traditional topic, subtopic, overuse of bullets. There's a lot of unnecessary information here. If my main idea is to define theme and motif, then I need to define theme and motif. All right, all of that other stuff can be put on a handout and handed to them in another form. So here, notice that you've got differences in font size. You have some words that are bolded, which kind of stick out to you. You've got the use of some arrows there, which kind of, the eye is naturally drawn to any kind of line, and you're going to follow the line to see where it leads. It's just natural. You're going to. So that kind of makes me, look from top to bottom there. And then they use the word convey in both definitions. They're using the first definition to define the second one. So there's lots of good stuff going on here. So this versus that, right? Then my next one is to kind of show the interplay between theme and plot and characters and director and all of that. And this is an example of what we call an information typology. So in PowerPoint, the one thing that I would highly encourage you to use that's kind of default templates in there is the smart art stuff. Not the word art, but the smart art. So smart art makes it very easy to communicate relationships, hierarchies, processes. It gives you good alternatives for displaying lists in non-bulleted forms. I really like smart art. I use it quite a bit. It's helpful. Another one of our design strategies is to use graphics with labels. So instead of just having 2 bullet points here that say IE means in other words, and then another bullet point that says EG means for example, I can use some graphics and then label those graphics. Okay, this gives me something as a learner to pull from memory that I've got a much better chance of pulling a graphic or a visual from my memory than I do 2 bullet points. This is another really popular one, to use a full screen image with a title. This is most commonly used for representational graphic. So representational just means I'm showing you a picture of something, right? So like if you're in an EMS class or something and you're showing them a picture of something that, like maybe a heart or aorta valve or something like that, that they really need to see what it looks like to really be able to appreciate it and learn what they need to learn, then you have to show them a representational graphic. This is what a heart looks like. These are the components of a heart. Or like in geography, like I need to show you a map, right? I can't tell you what Africa looks like any better way than showing you a picture of Africa, right? So the assertion evidence structure, this is one that we've seen used a couple of times already. And there's 4 steps to using this. First, we have to know what the main idea is. That's the first step in using any of these strategies, because our whole purpose for all of these visual aids is to support our main idea. So in all of these, we need to identify what the main idea is. Then we want to take that main idea and write it as a brief statement at the top or on the left. You can do a left, right, or a top, bottom, or whatever. But you want to write it as a brief statement somewhere on the slide. Use the remaining space of the slide to have a graphic that supports that assertion. And you want to make sure that your assertion is not just an explanation or a description of the graphic, but it's an actual assertion. So we're going to look at a couple of examples here. The final explosions of the 1883 Krakatoa eruption had massive effects. Okay, so this graphic does not necessarily support that. I don't really know, right? It might be Krakatoa, but even if I know that that's Krakatoa, I don't see any kind of massive effects there, right? So this would be a non-example of the assertion evidence structure, because here, I feel like that's probably a pretty good assertion. It could be, but the graphic doesn't support it, right? And so here, sales in American malls. Is that an assertion or a description? That's a description, right? That's more of a title than it is anything, right? So it's a good graphic, but I don't have an assertion. I have a description, right? So here, discount stores comprise the majority of sales in American malls. Now that's taking the graphic and pulling information out of it, right? That is an actual assertion. Okay, so this would be a good example of using the assertion evidence strategy effectively. Okay, so think of it as a headline and not a caption, right? You don't want to describe it, you want to make an assertion about it. So we want headlines and not captions. Okay, so here we're going to take this one and we're going to apply the assertion evidence strategy to it. So step one is to identify the main idea. Okay, so we've got the near side of the moon. We can see it from Earth. It's illuminated. There's dark spots, high in iron. All of that stuff kind of goes together. So really the main idea here is that the near side of the moon has some unique properties, right? This other stuff is not, it's kind of that semi-related stuff that doesn't really need to be there. Okay, so our main idea here is that the near side of the moon has some unique properties. Okay. And so we take that main idea, we write it at the top of the page as a brief statement, and then we have a graphic that supports that. Okay, so it's talking about these low-lying areas that are high in iron. Okay, so this is a pretty good example of it, but when I use this counter example of the far side of the moon, it makes it even better, right? Because here, I can't really appreciate that without this contrast of the other side, right? Now that I see on the other side those dark spots are not there, then that makes me appreciate what I'm seeing a little bit more, right? So counterexamples, the point being here, that counterexamples are very helpful as well. So, don't necessarily feel like you need to limit yourself to just having one graphic with this assertion evidence structure, especially if there's an opportunity to provide some contrast or counterexample. So what can we imply about these shapes? Do you think that they are closely related to one another? Are they in the same group with one another? They are all blue. So would you say, if you had to choose between the two statements, the shapes belong to the same group, the shapes do not belong to the same group, what would you say?
What group are you talking about?
Just generally.
Okay.
I'll say the same group. They seem pretty good, basic.
Right. Okay. What if I do this? Does that change your perception at all?
Change it to perception, but I still think they're the same group.
Right. So I meant to go backwards. To me, these two, I agree with you. I feel like they could still be in the same group, but I feel like they're less closely related. Whereas here, I feel like they have a lot in common and they're, tight-knit. Then here, yeah, they're still all blue. They're still all simple shapes, but they're less closely related than they were just by moving them further apart from one another, right? So using spatial positioning, we can communicate hierarchy, we can communicate relationships, we can communicate processes, and we can communicate anomalies, okay? So what I really like, though, and the thing that has kind of helped me a lot is using spatial positioning in conjunction with some other things. Okay, so how closely two things are together kind of gives me an idea about the relationship between the two things. But then when I start to add in some other design elements, that kind of enhances what I'm able to do. So let's go back to that same starting Yeah, okay. All right, so we said they're in the same group, right? All right, so how does that change your perception?
They're connected in some way.
All of them? Are some of them more connected than others?
Yes, the straight lines are connected more than the dotted lines are.
Right, so it could be seen as that the two on the left and the two on the right are connected, and then left to right on the top and left to right on bottom are connected. This connection is not the same as this connection. Maybe it's some sort of process where you're doing one thing here, a different thing across, So there's all different kind of things that this could be. The point that I'm trying to make here is that just by simply connecting these shapes with some lines, I've completely changed what it is that is being perceived here. Okay, so spatial positioning in conjunction with using lines, because like I said earlier, it's a natural inclination for us to follow a line. So also be careful. Don't just kind of throw lines out there because, again, if there's a line, I'm going to process it as something, right? So make sure that you're using it intentionally and not just leaving it out in the open as to what the purpose of this line is on this slide. Okay, so we said that these are still belonging to the same group, right? What about now?
Now they seem separated.
Right, so using two lines, I've taken this and completely changed the perception of it, right? Whereas they were in the same group, now they're not. I've used two lines to separate them. They're no longer in the same group. So I'm using spatial positioning and lines in conjunction with one another to communicate ideas very easily, really. There's no text here, but there's a lot of things that are being communicated just by how close or how far things are, and then some simple use of lines. Okay, again, going back to our original picture. Okay, would you say now that they are definitely in the same group?
Yes.
Okay, so again, I'm still using lines, but now I'm using really a shape, right? Lines that are enclosed around something. So shapes are a great way for us to communicate inclusion or exclusion from a group. Okay, so these are all in the same group, yes? What about now? They still all in the same group? All right, so all I've done is just move it on the other side of this line. So pretty powerful what we can do with just spatial positioning and some lines. As a side note, when we're talking about shapes and symbols and things of that nature, all symbols don't mean the same thing everywhere. Like we said earlier with the elephant, in our culture, we all pretty much know an elephant never forgets. But in other cultures, you might not know that, or an elephant might have a different meaning. So just be careful with how you're using symbols. For us, we see this as good job, thumbs up, right? And in many countries, it's the same thing. In other countries, it might get you punched in the face, right? So just be aware of the fact that some symbols have cultural meaning attached to them, and be cognizant of the symbols that you use in your slides. Another thing that we kind of have at our disposal here, and so try not to read any of the text and just look at the surface level design features there and tell me what you can kind of tell from this slide.
The darks all go together and
Right. Yeah. So just by using some very basic surface level design features, right? Blue squares and white squares, I have conveyed a fairly complex relationship among a lot of things very easily, right? I know that the blue goes with the blue and the white goes with the white. So instead of just having a bunch of bullet points, I've chosen to do this kind of in a different way. And so proximity and similarity, along with spatial positioning, are all ways that we can kind of communicate different types of relationships. Another design element that's kind of been at play in all of these that we haven't really talked about Well, how many design elements do you see on this slide? 1, 2, 5, 7, how many?
Could be two. You got space and then you got.
Right, so a lot of people would say, the 90. A lot of people would just say, one, that the black dot is the only design element that you have. But the negative space, or the white space, is also a very important, often overlooked, often underused design element. And white space is not necessarily just space that is white, right? So it's the same thing here. It's just reversed. So instead of thinking as white space as space that is white, just think of it as the absence of content, right? And when you begin to think of white space as one of the design tools that you have in your design toolbox, it fundamentally changes the way you design things. When you from the ground floor, you're thinking, okay, how can I use this space? And also the other side of that is, I think a lot of times we feel like we need to fill up the whole slide. And that's not the case at all. Again, with spatial positioning and all of that, space between things can be just as powerful, if not more powerful, than having too much stuff. And if we have too much stuff, we have those slides that we looked at earlier that I don't even know where to start looking at this.
So let me ask you this, if you are going to design something that you want to kind of hit them in the face,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like when you are emailing, if you do all caps, that's
Mhm.
basically saying I'm shouting at you.
Yes,
So could you kind of use that?
you
Caps,
could.
Convey, this is really important, wake up, you know.
If the only way that you can really do that is if you use it sparingly, just like, right. Like I said earlier, inconsistency draws questions, whereas consistency enables me to use novelty, right? So if I never use all caps, then when I do, then it's going to jump out, right? Now, some people would say never use all caps because, like you said, it's perceived as yelling.
So that's what I'm wondering, is it a no-no?
I think it actually says in the book to not use all caps, but I use all caps sometimes. I mean, it's kind of whatever you think, I feel like. All right, so getting closer to the end here, talking about some layout and composition items. Again, with our layout and composition, we want to be consistent in our placement of repeated items. This goes back to what we've mentioned several times, that it helps with wayfinding. Wayfinding means, how students are able to kind of know where they are in the presentation, how much have we covered, how much do we have left, what is the context of where I'm at in the presentation. So the fact that I have this slide lets me know, or lets you know, what we're about to start talking about. Right? So if I have those guidepost slides throughout, that helps the students to kind of have some context about what I'm talking about. And so 3 main issues with composition, and we've kind of touched on all of these up to this point. A lack of a point of entry. That's like that slide earlier that had so much going on with all the colors and everything. You don't really know where to look first. A lack of a focal point. And then again, with that same slide, if everything is the focal point, then nothing is the focal point, right? And then a failure to comply with established norms. That's the whole left to right, top to bottom. There's a certain way that we expect things to be presented to us. So we want to make sure that we stay within those expected norms, and we don't, do things that break those norms. All right, so yes or no, does this have a good point of entry?
No.
I say no. There's too much going on. the thing that catches my eye first is the little cycle in the upper left-hand corner, but I'm immediately like, why is this important? How does this relate to anything else? And it doesn't catch my attention for long because there's all this other stuff going on, and I'm drawn to what's going on down at the bottom. Like, is it important for me to read all of that? Do I need to know like what all these different colors mean? So there's a lot going on here. So well, you tell me what design strategy is used here. We've looked at it several times now.
1 point.
Yeah, right now.
Well, a specific strategy would be that assertion evidence strategy, right? So I've got an assertion that I've made up at the top, and then I've got a graphic that ties to that. So again, looking at the before and after, you know, I don't need to know what all those colors are for. I know that there's some differences, right? Just by looking at this, like, okay, I know there's, around the country, there's a lot of differences going on here. I don't need to necessarily know what those are. If it is very important for me to know what those are, put them on a handout, hand it to me, I'll read it later. But during the presentation, this is all I need to know. All right, what about this? Is there a good focal point here? Is there one thing that just hits you in the face?
Symbols.
Symbols? There's a lot of symbols. That would be like my main takeaway from this, just because you got the word, and then you've got the 3 different types of symbols going on. But again, I would say there's too much going on, right? So you want to, like you say symbols is the focal point. It could be very easy for somebody else to think that this thing over here on the right with the hieroglyphs is the focal point. It could be equally as easy for somebody to say that the people right in the middle, the little orange people there, are the focal point. So, it's to each his own. So what I want to do is I want to make there be no question of what the focal point is, right? So here, now the big circle, there's really no question. That's what the focal point is. So that's where I look first. Then my eye is drawn directly down, and I'm seeing, oh, okay, they're zooming in on this hieroglyph thing here. And then I can read the text to kind of see what's going on. So you want to have one and only one focal point. You don't want to have multiple focal points, and you don't want it to even be possible for the student to wonder what the focal point might be. All right, so what's the problem with this? We perceive things as moving from left to right. Okay, so, and again, some of these things are like, really? I mean, is it really that big a deal? But, to some people, that might be very confusing and unsettling, for like some people with OCD that need things to be the way things are supposed to be. It might be unsettling for them. And it just, it's easy to fix those type things. So if we know that these are issues, then just flip it around. So the other thing that I notice here is first of all, we're going left to right now like we're supposed to. The other thing that I notice is the color red is a little less extreme. So a lot of people will tell you to never use red. I disagree with that. But for the most part, you don't want it to be like super bright red. So they've kind of toned down the redness there. And the last little section that we're going to talk about is typeface, which is to say font. So what's the first thing you notice about the flyer there on the right?
Bunch of, yeah.
Color.
Colors and different size.
Right. You got different size fonts. You got different types of fonts. So what we want is our students or our audience to not notice the font, right? If they're not noticing the font, then that means I've done my job correctly. So you should really only ever use 2 at the most. Not that it can't be done, but it's actually fairly difficult to use 3, 4 different types of fonts and do it in such a way that the audience is not going to notice it. Like, you almost have to be a professional graphic designer. So what I usually do is I just use 1 font and that's it. Times New Roman, Arial, Georgia, Verdania. Those are the ones that I usually stick with. So yeah, I thought it said, don't use all caps. And these things are, for me, I did all of these. So it was hard for me to get out of some of the habits that I had, especially italicizing, because I used italics a lot. But what I've found is if I use my bolding very strategically, I don't need to use italics. So, and then with the underline, that really kind of goes back to some accessibility issues too. Underline should only be used for hyperlinks. So that's something that I agree with completely, and I've tried to get away from using underlining altogether unless it's a hyperlink. Centering text, I really liked centered text, but I'll show you in a minute why not to use it. And then mixing fonts, which I really never did that, so it really wasn't something. But a lot of these were habits of mine that I had to consciously try and break. So, and you know, I mean, I still say if you're like, you know what, I use italics and I don't think there's anything wrong with it, fine, then use it. This is just what this one specific book says. So here, which one is easier to read? When I saw this, I was like, oh, okay, it makes sense. And then it's like, you know, once you see something, you can't unsee it. If you ever saw something in your house after living there for like 5 years, and then you're like, how have I not seen this for 5 years? And then from that point on, every time you walk by it, you notice it. It's like some things once you see, like there was a room in a house that I lived at once that was out of square, and the corner went like that. And I'd lived there for 2 years without noticing it. And then one day I was like, that corner goes up and to the left like a lot. And then it just drove me nuts. I couldn't unsee it. And that's how it was with this. When I saw this, every time I saw centered text after that, I was just like, oh my gosh, it's like nails on a chalkboard. It's just easier to read when it's left justified. That's not to say never center text. But if you'll pay attention, there are times when if you'll just left align it, it will make your design better. Pay attention to your spacing. These two slides have the exact same text on them, but the one on the left looks like it has 7 things that it's talking about, whereas the one on the right is obviously only 4 things. I was going to take the time to kind of go in and look at how to fix those things, but we're already running kind of way over on time. Really, most of the time what will fix it is just going from double space to single space. But again, just kind of being conscious of it, your spacing and your alignment, that helps a lot. So some ways that we can guide students' attention, and I know a lot of y'all use this first one, which is called progressive disclosure, right? So you can use that to reveal information at a slower rate so that the students are getting it at the rate that you want them to get it. This is also called conceal and reveal. Progressive disclosure, conceal and reveal. We can use color to guide our students' attention, right? So on the right-hand side there, they're both the same graphics, but the one on the right-hand side, the guy with his arm sticking up is much more pronounced, right? Because he's a different color. So we can use color. We can point at things. This is called signaling. So you can either use something like this, or you can use your finger, or you can use a laser pointer, or whatever. But signaling and saying, "Hey, look here," which is a pretty common thing that we do. And then the other thing is to annotate, right? So I can take my pen here, and I can circle him and annotate my slides. So you've got using color. Signaling, annotating, and then using spatial positioning, which is one that we have already talked about. Okay, so our last summary slide here, again, I want to reiterate one main idea per slide. We can use spatial positioning and white space, along with, the use of lines and colors and proximity and similarity and some of those design strategies like graphics with labels and assertion and evidence. But, the two things that kind of stuck out to me as things that I feel like you can add to your toolkit that are likely not there right now is being very conscious of using spatial positioning and white space as some of your design elements. Provide a point of entry and a focal point in all of your slides. Pay attention to the spacing and alignment between your text, especially if you're using bullet points, which we know there is a time and a place for. And then use one font throughout your presentation. Don't use a bunch of different types of font or colored fonts. And for the most part, you don't want to use more than 2 or 3 different sizes. So you'll have title size, heading size, and then a body size. Okay? Like I said, this all came, for the most part, with the exception of the cognitive load stuff, from this book, Academic Slide Design. You can find it online. Just Google Academic Slide Design. I want to say I had to download it in pieces.
17 parts.
Yes, there's several parts, but I did. I downloaded all of them, printed them all out, hole punched them, put them in a binder, and so now I have that book. It's a really easy book to read. If you found this interesting and, just kind of design generally interests you, she's a very good writer. It's an easy read. It's not overly cerebral or academic, and obviously all the things that I talked about are in there, but it goes into a lot more detail and a lot more depth.